You know, in geopolitics, you'd think a country's internal values and its foreign policy would pretty much line up, right? Well, India is presenting us with a fascinating and honestly a pretty confusing puzzle. Domestically, its politics are heading in one very clear direction, but its foreign policy seems to be sprinting in the complete opposite. It's this paradox that really forces us to question what we think we know about how a nation's identity shapes its relationships with the rest of the world.
So here's the contradiction in a nutshell. On one hand, you have India's domestic politics, which are more and more being defined by Hindutva, a Hindu nationalist ideology. But at the exact same time, India is busy building its strongest ever strategic partnerships with the very heart of the Islamic world. We're talking about the Gulf monarchies.
So you have to ask, how on earth does a government manage to live in two such different realities at once? Is this just a brilliant diplomatic balancing act? Or is it a fundamental contradiction that's just waiting to fall apart? Let's dive in and break it down. All right, the first and maybe the most powerful piece of this puzzle is just plain and simple economics. Seriously, if you follow the money, the logic behind India's foreign policy starts to make a whole lot more sense. The numbers we're about to see are just too massive to ignore. First, let's just talk about the sheer scale of trade. We're talking about over $100 billion flowing between India and the 6 Gulf nations every single year. This is not a minor deal. For India, the Gulf has become a primary trading hub, so much so that in some years it's bigger than its trade with the US and the European Union combined. And then there's the people factor. You've got more than 8 million Indians living and working in the Middle East. Every year, they send home over $35 billion. Now, that's not just some abstract number. It's an absolutely crucial economic lifeline that directly supports something like 30 million family members back in India. And it's not a one-way street either. The money flows both ways. The UAE alone has set aside a massive $75 billion to invest in building India's future. We're talking railways, ports, roads, the whole 9 yards. This is a huge strategic bet on India's growth, and it's critical for India to hit its own development targets. So here's the key takeaway on the money front. These economic ties, the trade, the money sent home, the investments, they aren't just nice-to-haves. They are the absolute, non-negotiable bedrock of this relationship. This creates such a powerful incentive for a practical, interest-based approach that any ideological stuff just kind of has to take a back seat.
So the economic reasons are pretty crystal clear. But, this isn't just about money. There's actually a deep-rooted foreign policy doctrine that gives the intellectual framework for all of this. And it's something that has guided India for decades.
That doctrine is called strategic autonomy. And what it boils down to really is flexibility. It means India avoids getting locked into any single camp or rigid alliance. Instead, it builds partnerships based on specific issues with any country, whether they're a friend or a rival, wherever their interests happen to line up. This lets India keep its independence and maximize its options on the world stage.
And this is not some new idea cooked up yesterday. As the former ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon points out, this has been the common thread in Indian foreign policy for a very long time. It's a core principle that says India's national interest comes before any strict ideological promises.
And you can see how this core idea has kind of morphed over the years. Back in the Cold War, they called it non-alignment. More recently, you might hear the term multi-alignment. The names keep changing, but that fundamental goal of protecting India's freedom to act has always been the same.
Okay, so how does this whole playbook of strategic autonomy and multi-alignment actually play out in a place as complicated as West Asia? This is where the rubber really meets the road.
This is the juggling act in real time. Just look at this. With the Gulf states like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, the focus is all about energy and investment. With Israel, it's all about defense and high tech. And then with Iran, who's a rival to both of the others, India focuses on things like regional connectivity. New Delhi is literally building strong, separate relationships with all three, all at the same time.
And maybe the best example of this whole strategy is the I2U2 group. Just think about it for a second. This partnership brings India together with Israel and the UAE, 2 countries that, until very recently, didn't even have formal relations, and the United States. It's a super flexible, issue-based coalition focused on economic projects, and it perfectly shows how India is able to work with and around all these regional rivalries.
So far, this strategy has been working out surprisingly well. But, and this is a big but, there is one major risk. A deep fault line that could potentially bring the whole thing crashing down.
And that fault line runs straight from India's domestic politics to its foreign partnerships.
As a former ambassador to the UAE, Navdeep Suri puts it, what happens inside India doesn't stay inside India. Controversial events, especially those involving India's Muslim minority, create these unpleasant ripples in the Gulf. This is the exact point where those two worlds, domestic politics and foreign policy, can have a really nasty collision.
And there are so many potential flashpoints, right? A controversial comment by a politician, a violent incident, and thanks to social media, these things can go global in an instant, sparking outrage across the Muslim world. That puts a ton of pressure on Gulf leaders, who then have to answer to their own people, many of whom are really disturbed by what they're seeing coming out of India.
Now, traditionally, the Gulf monarchies have this unspoken rule. You don't comment on my internal affairs, and I won't comment on yours. It's a code of mutual silence. But the game is changing. With social media and a more aware public, it's getting a lot harder for these governments to just look the other way, which makes this domestic fault line more and more dangerous.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this all up. We have an Indian foreign policy that's driven by economic needs and guided by this idea of strategic autonomy. But this very practical approach is under constant threat from its own domestic ideological project. So what's the bottom line?
The conclusion, for now, seems pretty clear. In the world of foreign policy, pragmatic realism is winning the day. The sheer necessity of trade, investment, and energy is basically forcing India to put its material national interests first and foremost. It seems that, at the end of the day, economics is trumping ideology.
And that leaves us with the ultimate question, doesn't it? Is what we're witnessing a sophisticated new blueprint for how a rising power can navigate a really complex world by juggling interests and ideologies? Or is it just an unstable paradox, a high-wire act where the economic needs and the domestic politics are on a collision course, and eventually something has got to give? The answer to that is going to define India's role in the world for decades to come.